Morning to you. If you weren't awake, you're awake now. If you got your Bible with you, be opening up to John chapter 8. John chapter 8, that is where we're going to find the beginning place for our study this morning and really where we're going to spend the majority of our time. John chapter 8. Have you ever experienced disappointment before? It's kind of a duh question, isn't it? In Longview, back where we lived for a decade or so, there are two major hospitals there. There is Longview Regional Medical Center, and then there's what everybody still calls Good Shepherd Medical Center. It's been bought out, name has changed, but everyone still calls it Good Shepherd. And Good Shepherd's in the older part of town. You're in the downtown area, and you've got a church building right near Good Shepherd that on every half hour and every hour chimes its bells. And you can hear it all across downtown. You can hear it very clearly in the parking lot. And if your windows are facing the right way in the hospital, you can hear them in the hospital. And there was a lady who had undergone surgery, was in anesthesia, was coming up out of anesthesia. And as she was coming up out of anesthesia, she heard the church bells off in the background. And she said, "I must be in heaven." And then Dr. Smith came walking around the corner, and she says, "Nope, I can't be in heaven. Dr. Smith is here." Disappointment. We have all experienced it in some way before. It's something that Jesus himself experienced as well. We can read in John's gospel account in another place about how Jesus wept there at Lazarus' tomb. We see Jesus weeping in the garden. And here in John chapter 8, although it is not specifically stated that way, I would submit to you that we see another moment in which Jesus experienced disappointment. Not disappointment with himself, not disappointment with the gospel, not disappointment with his Father, but disappointment with people. Disappointment with people because of the choices that they made. And we want to look at this episode in Jesus' life this morning. We're going to call this the day that it all went downhill, and it's there in John chapter 8. If you got your New Testaments, let's get there and let's get started. If you ever do a read-through of the book of John, I know we're coming up on the new year. Maybe you like to try to read through the Bible in a year. Maybe try to read through the New Testament in a year. Maybe try to read through the Gospels in a year. John's Gospel account is really easy to break up. You have about 4 different Passovers in John's Gospel account. And each one of those help divide up the adult ministry of Jesus. Here in John chapter 8, we are within about the last 6 months of Jesus' ministry. In John chapter 6, you have the 3rd Passover of John's gospel account mentioned. In chapter 7, you have another time marker that's given that's going to put you about 6 months after that Passover. And in chapter 13 and verse 1, you're at Passover number 4. And so you're at about 6 months, give or take, left in Jesus' ministry as we're here in John chapter 8. So Jesus has been on the scene, he has been teaching, he is well known. So John 8 through John 20 is really about 7 months all compressed into that time frame. Here in John chapter 8, the first 11 verses is a story many of us are familiar with. Jesus and the woman who was taken in adultery. Jesus gives that notable statement, "Neither do I condemn you, go your way. And from now on, sin no more." He's going to make one of his I am statements in chapter 8 and verse 12 when he says, "I am the light of the world." And then we've got this notable interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees starting here in chapter 8 and verse 13. The Pharisees, and notice this with me if you would, "The Pharisees therefore said to him, 'You are bearing witness of yourself, and your witness is not true.'" We're going to come back to that in just a moment, but put a tack there in your mind. That's significant, and we're coming back to it. In chapter 8 and verse 30, we find that many Jews came to believe in Jesus after his encounter with the Pharisees here. And then Jesus began to speak to those Jews who had believed in him about being his disciples and about the true freedom that he offers. And this is where we get notable statements such as, if I speak the truth, verse 46, why do you not believe me? Verse 49, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. This is where the Jews make the statements, Abraham is our father, we have never been in bondage to any man. But Jesus is going to reason with them about truth, about Abraham, about his nature, about God. And I want you to notice how all of this ends in chapter 8 and verse 59. Jesus makes the statement, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And in verse 59, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and he went out of the temple. That is John 8, just a cursory reading of it in a nutshell. There's a lot to dig out here, something that we can make a good application to in our lives. I want you to notice this with me. I had never caught this before until I did my most recent read-through of this. Maybe you've caught this before and you're just more perceptive than I am. But on the off chance that you haven't caught this before, check this out with me. Verse 13, we introduced the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees then said to him, but they're going to disappear after verse 29. The Pharisees disappear after verse 29. Verse 30 puts a capstone on this. He spoke these things, and many came to believe in him. And then verse 31, he turns to a new audience, not the Pharisees, but to those Jews who had believed in him. We're not going to get the Pharisees again until chapter 9 and verse 13, when they bring to the Pharisees the man who was formerly blind, whom Jesus had healed. Here's the significance of all of this. The Pharisees then are not under consideration in chapter 8, verses 31 through 59. When Jesus is talking about Abraham, our father, and being in bondage, and God and Jesus is claiming to be I am, he's not making that statement to the Pharisees. He's making those statements, John 8, 30 and 31, to those Jews who had believed in him. Which then is going to make what happens in verse 59 all the more interesting. Because it's not the Pharisees who try to kill Jesus. This is the part I had missed. It's not the Pharisees who try to kill Jesus here. It's the very people he'd been reasoning with. Going back to verses 30 and 31 and 32, the people who tried to kill Jesus were the ones who believed in him. So, our question then, how did it all go downhill so quickly? We're not talking about a long period of time. We're not talking about weeks or months or years or decades. We're talking about a day. We're talking about an hour where people go from absolutely believing in who Jesus is and being absolutely enthralled and enraptured by who he is and what he offers, to moments later picking up stones to throw at him and kill him. How did it all go downhill so quickly? Let me submit two ideas to you. Number one, it was because the depth of belief simply wasn't present among his hearers. Look there with me in verses 30 and 31 and 32. Jesus spoke these things, and many came to believe in him. He had been speaking, you remember, back in verse 13 with the Pharisees. So he has had this back and forth with the Pharisees. There have been people in the audience who have been hearing, who have been enthralled by what he has to say. Here is somebody, the lesser parts of us might say, here is somebody giving it right back to the Pharisees. They had been a thorn in the sides of people for so long, don't you know people were sick of them? And here is somebody going tit for tat with the Pharisees, giving it right back to them. You almost sit back and think some of them might have been very quietly clapping their hands and cheering on Jesus. And they believed in what he had to say. And then Jesus turned to them and said, "If you abide in my word, then you are truly my disciples, and you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Jesus there in verse 31 uses a significant word, "if you abide in my word." He wasn't and he isn't simply calling on people to simply have a passing acknowledgement of who he is and of what he does and of what he can accomplish in our lives. Jesus doesn't want that from us. And if that's all we're going to offer Jesus, he's not going to accept it. He wants us, as we see here in verse 31, to abide in his word. And by abiding in his word, that is what is going to ultimately lead us to eternal life. That's going to be the point as you look here going on in verse 32. You shall know the truth, and the truth is going to set you free. And then the promise he's going to continue on and give of everlasting life. All of that is what is going to come through Jesus and through abiding in his word. The word abide simply means to stay, to abide. Apparently you can define a word by a word. You can stay, you can abide, you continue in something, to dwell in. This is something in which you take root. Right? This is the foundation of who we are. That's what Jesus is communicating here. If you make my words the center core of who you are, if you build on me and my words, well, then you're truly my disciples and you'll know the truth. And the truth will set you free. The people here had been introduced to Jesus. They'd been introduced to belief in Jesus, but they needed to be willing to pursue something more. Notice with me what the people had believed about Jesus up to this point. Go back to chapter 8 and verse 16. Catch the highlights of what the crowd heard Jesus say to the Pharisees. In chapter 8 and verse 16, Jesus states that he had been sent by the Father. In verse 21, Jesus states that the Pharisees are sinful. He said, therefore, again to the Pharisees, I go away, and you shall seek me, and you shall die in your sins. Where I am going, you cannot come. I mean, you talk about Jesus really taking it to a group of people. He's taking it to the Pharisees here. And the crowd was eating up every moment of it. He proclaimed in verse 23, I am from above and you are of this world. I am not of this world. Verse 24, I am, Jesus says. Except you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. He claims that he is speaking the words of God. Verse 26, I have many things to speak and to judge concerning you, but he who sent me is true, and the things which I have heard from him, these I speak to the world, and they did not realize that he had been speaking to them about the Father. He spoke about being lifted up in verse 28. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. And he says in verse 29 that he always does those things that are pleasing to the Father. That's what the people heard. They seized on that message. They loved that message. That message was inspiring. That message was a rebuke to the surface level allegiance that the Pharisees had placed on their service to God. They believed about Jesus, but there wasn't any real depth to that. And that's part of what led things to go downhill. What else led to things going downhill is the fact that Jesus kept talking. I mean, you think about it with me. Stop in verse 32. If we stop in verse 32, we never get where? Stop in verse 32, we never get to verse 59, do we? There's praise and adulation. There's glory to Jesus, glory to God, and we're done. But Jesus kept talking, didn't he? He didn't stop there in verses 30 and 31 and 32. He had more to say. The people believed, but they needed to believe more. There was more they needed to know, more they needed to understand, more they needed to believe, and so Jesus kept talking. But he had already brought them to belief. Why then keep talking? Only if their belief was immature and needed to be more fully formed. And so Jesus kept talking to them, didn't he? He kept talking to them. Listen to what he said. Look, for example, at verse 34. Jesus answered them after they said, "We are Abraham's offspring and we've never been in bondage to anyone." Jesus responded and said to them, "Truly I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin." Jesus said, you're in sin and you're in bondage to sin. In verse 36, "If therefore the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." Jesus says to them, freedom does not come through being Abraham's descendant, but freedom comes through me. He had called himself, he had claimed to be the I am earlier. But now he's saying, I can make you free. Not Abraham, not Moses, but me. Then he says to them in verses 39 and 40, "Abraham is not your father. If you are Abraham's children, then do the deeds of Abraham. But as it is, you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth which I heard from God. Abraham didn't do this. If you're Abraham's children, listen to me. Accept what I'm saying. Abraham heard of me and rejoiced about me. But you're not doing that. You're seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth." They argue with him. Jesus says then in verse 44, what? This will turn a crowd. Chapter 8, verse 44, "You are of your father the devil." That's either really going to get people's attention or it's going to shut your audience down. But remember who's saying this. It's Jesus, isn't it? Jesus is saying this. He's not doing it wrong. And he's saying, not just to a person, to a group of people, you are of your father, the devil. And you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And you are of your father, the devil, the father of lies. What does that say about you? Why keep talking? Jesus, you just lost your audience. Jesus, it's no wonder that 15 verses later, they're going to take up stones and try to kill you. You just said Satan is your father. That's going to shut down anybody. Why say it then? Could it possibly be that Jesus said that because that's exactly what they needed to hear? What they needed to hear and what they wanted to hear were two very, very different things. Jesus wasn't necessarily giving them only what they wanted to hear. They'd heard what they wanted to hear back beginning in verse 14 when Jesus had his interaction with the Pharisees. But now, in addition to giving them what they wanted to hear, he is giving them what they needed to hear. Look at John 12, just very briefly. Flip a few pages over. Catch this with me. John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43. Let's understand, let's get this settled in our mind. Jesus wants more than just simple belief. He wants more than just mere acknowledgement from us, from these people back in John chapter 8. Verse 42, "Nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing." They believed, but they would not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. That kind of belief just wasn't going to cut it for Jesus. Wasn't going to cut it for serving God. And it doesn't suffice today. Our belief has to be deeper and more substantial. Our belief has to be the kind of belief that Jesus is talking about here in John chapter 8, abiding in his word. Jesus kept talking because he needed to develop deeper faith in these people. And the sad result is they didn't want the fullness of Jesus' message. And so in verse 59, they took up stones with which to stone him. Let's look at some practical applications then that we can make for our study this morning. 4 simple points and then we're done this morning. The first one being this. If I'm going to believe in Jesus, that means I'm going to believe in all that Jesus says. Remember Luby's cafeteria? Right? We got one that, I don't know if we still have one in San Antonio. We got the one that shut down over near our house. Had them all over East Texas, right? There were 2 great things about Luby's. Everybody knows what they were. What are they? Macaroni and cheese and Jell-O. That's right. Right. Don't bring up the fried fish. Don't bring up meatloaf. It was macaroni and cheese and Jell-O, and it was the blue Jell-O or the green Jell-O, and that's it, right? So what'd you do? What'd you do at Luby's? You got your tray, and you got your plate, and before COVID hit and everybody got really sensitive about this stuff, you got to ladle your food on your plate, right? And you're going to have a little bit of this, you're going to have a little bit of that, and the only green you're going to have on your plate is what? Yes, you caught it, right, the Jell-O, right? There's no broccoli, no spinach, no salad, none of that. If you're getting your greens, you're getting green Jell-O. Macaroni and cheese counts as a vegetable at Luby's, and so there you go. You've got all of your bases covered. But folks, isn't that how religion ends up being treated sometimes? That we're going to take a little bit of this, we're going to take a little bit of that. I don't want the spinach, I don't want the broccoli, I don't want the green beans, so I'm going to push back on that. I'll take a little of this, a little of that, and then we'll be done. And now I'm taking my tray and I'm going to be with Jesus. But that's not what Jesus presents to us, is it? We can't walk away from the pages of John chapter 8 under the impression that I can take and refuse Jesus at my leisure and it be pleasing to him. If I'm going to believe in Jesus, if I'm going to truly be his disciple like he talks about in verses 31 and 32, I've got to believe in all that Jesus has to say. Don't miss this point here in John chapter 8. They loved what Jesus had to say until Jesus started talking about them. They loved it when Jesus was talking about the Pharisees because they had the same gripes with the Pharisees. But then Jesus made the point that it's not just the Pharisees who are lost. Jesus says, beginning in verse 33, you're lost too. And that wasn't the message they wanted to hear. Make no mistake, it was the message they needed to hear. But it wasn't what they wanted to hear. Here is where we have to do a good job as listeners, as readers of the gospel, as listeners to teaching and preaching. We've got to be able to parse out and separate those moments when we don't want to hear something, but we really, really do need to hear it. You ever felt that way in a sermon before? I felt that way preaching the sermons before. There are things you have to say that you don't want to say because you know how it's going to impact somebody, or more than that, you know you're going to have to make some changes in your own life. It's not necessarily what we want to hear, but it's what we need to hear. If macaroni and cheese are the only vegetable that we're getting in our lives, our bodies aren't going to be very healthy, are they? If green Jell-O is the only green we're eating in our lives, our bodies are not going to be very healthy. It may not be what we want, Bree. It may not be broccoli, or so she's not even paying attention. Sometimes we got to eat our broccoli. Sometimes we got to eat our spinach. Sometimes we got to eat our green beans and our peas and our carrots and all that stuff. I don't want to, but I need to. Except onions. Nobody needs onions. They liked what Jesus said until it started applying to them, and that was the problem. That's when this whole dynamic changes. Jesus identified their bondage. You are enslaved to sin, just like the Pharisees that we talked about. Don't think you get off scot-free. The Pharisees are in bondage to sin, but so are you. You shall know the truth, and the truth is going to make you free. But Jesus, we're Abraham's descendants. We've never been in bondage to anyone. Pause button. The entire Old Testament history we've been discussing on Sunday nights. How often were they in bondage to man? Time after time after time after time. So then how can you say to this, you will be made free? Jesus, truly I say to you, verse 34, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. You are in sin, Jesus says to them. And they say, no, we are not. Think about this. Nothing is more offensive than hope to a person who is convinced they don't need it. Nothing could be more offensive to these people than what Jesus said at this moment, offering them hope because they weren't convinced that they needed it. We're good. I don't need to be made free. I'm Abraham's descendant. I've never been in bondage. I don't need hope. What are you talking about, Jesus? You can make me free. I'm free already. But they weren't. They didn't see that. But Jesus knew that. He had to convince his audience that they were lost. You think about the reality that Jesus is either the Lord of all of my life or he is the Lord of none of my life. There's no cafeteria-style religion here. He's either everything to me or he's nothing. If I'm going to believe in Jesus, I've got to believe in all that Jesus has to say. Think about this then. Here's a practical application from John 8. If Jesus was rejected, I'm going to be rejected too. That's hard, isn't it? We identify people that we want to share the gospel with. We pour over our heads and our minds how we're going to share the gospel with them. Maybe we prepare a study. Maybe we write something. Maybe we create illustrations. Maybe we create diagrams. We put effort and time, and we pour our hearts into it, and then somebody responds like they do here in John chapter 8. What are you doing? Why are you offering me freedom? Don't you know I'm already free? Why are you talking to me about salvation? Don't you know I'm already saved? Why are you talking to me about holiness? Am I not good enough for you? Think about the reality that if Jesus was rejected, I'm going to be rejected too. But notice this, that number one, Jesus doesn't stop teaching. And number two, Jesus doesn't change his message. Too often what happens is upon the moment of rejection, we decide, whether we as individuals or a church may decide that, we've just got to stop talking about this. Authority, marriage, homosexuality, baptism. We've either just got to stop talking about these things or we just change it. I know that Jesus said, don't divorce. And marriage is supposed to be one man and one woman for always. But if you and your spouse don't get along, it's okay. Not that big of a deal. That's not really the person that you married. God will understand. But folks, that changes the message. And that is demonstrably what Jesus did not do. And if Jesus upon rejection doesn't change the gospel, why would we think that that's the right tactic for us to take? He didn't stop. He didn't change his message. And so we shouldn't either. My belief in Jesus, then, is not full if I reject his teaching. We mentioned marriage, what Jesus says about marriage in Matthew chapter 19, one man and one woman for life. Do not divorce except for sexual immorality. Hey, if my teaching on marriage and divorce doesn't mimic Jesus's, there's a divide there that needs to get fixed, and what needs to get fixed is not Jesus teaching, it's what I believe and what I'm teaching. Or what Jesus had to say about baptism, go into all the world. Right? Matthew 28:18-20. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore into all the world, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you. Teach them, baptize them, teach them. If the way that I'm approaching this doesn't line up with Jesus, it's not Jesus who needs to change. It's me. And just because I am met with rejection doesn't mean that I am doing something wrong, that we as a church are doing something wrong, or that we need to change the teaching or change the methods. God's people have always experienced rejection. I know what it feels like to be rejected on many different levels. I know what it's like to be rejected teaching the gospel. You do too. You've felt that before, and it hurts. But if there's any comfort in that, it's the reality that God's people have experienced that from the beginning. Hebrews chapter 11, the Hebrew writer talks to us about time failing him to talk about those who were persecuted, who wandered in sheepskins and goatskins, naked and afflicted and persecuted. God's people have always been rejected by the world. And while it hurts in the moment, and I'm not trying to minimize any of it, there is a certain comfort that can come from that by realizing we are there with Jesus and we are there with his people when we experience rejection. Not that we glory that people reject it, but that we understand, you know, if we were being accepted all of the time, that would probably say something more about the message that we're sharing. Considering what Jesus had to say about the broad way and the narrow way. God's people have always experienced rejection from men, but they have also always experienced full acceptance from God. That's why it's so important for us, for example, to know God's word. Because when the world tells me I'm wrong, going to God's word, I can find out, no, I'm not wrong. And if I have the approval of God, that's the only approval I need. If Jesus was rejected, I'm going to be rejected too, and that doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong. Think about this. We do a disservice when we obscure or hide parts of the gospel. What do we say? Jesus could have just stopped there at verse 32, right? He had them believing. Jesus said these things to those Jews who believed in him. Jesus, just don't say anything else. They believe. You've got them right where you want them. You don't need to say anything else. So why did Jesus keep talking? Because there was more that they needed. Even at the risk of them turning away from what they'd already accepted. Look at Acts chapter 20. Do you remember Paul talking to the Ephesian elders here in Acts chapter 20? He makes this statement down here in Acts chapter 20 and verse 27 that I did not shrink back from declaring to you what? The whole counsel of God. Everything that they needed to hear, Paul shared with them. Some of those conversations were comfortable. Some of those conversations, no doubt, were uncomfortable. But look at verse 32. Whether comfortable or uncomfortable, the conversations had to be had. Because that was the only way that his audience, the people that he loved so dearly, would be able to find their inheritance amongst all those who were sanctified. I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you the inheritance among those who were sanctified. Jesus had them believing, but he also knew that there was more that they needed to accept. And so he kept speaking. You know, it might be blissful ignorance on my part. I've never known of a circumstance where a prospective Christian was left to just kind of figure it out for themselves how to come into Christ, to find the ladder over the wall. maybe it's blissful ignorance. I've never experienced that. But I'll tell you what circumstances I have known. I have known of circumstances where prospective or new Christians were not told the full counsel of God, at risk of offending them, right? At risk of offending them or turning them away or turning them off. I've seen topics like baptism or repentance or marriage or intoxicants be ignored or kind of pushed to the side or pushed away or not even addressed because it might offend somebody. It might turn them off. It might, some reason goes, do more harm than good. But I want you to look at Acts 20 again that we just read. And then think about what Jesus said there and what Jesus did in John chapter 8. And I want you to answer this question with me. Are we really doing people a service by intentionally keeping parts of the gospel from them? And I'm not saying that we look, there are moments we're going to be sharing the gospel with somebody who is in a situation that they're going to have to change. That's part of what coming to God is all about, right? Repentance. We've all experienced that. For some of us, the repentance is larger than others. But we're going to be sitting there talking with somebody about something they need to change in their lives. Do we just ignore it? John 8, Acts 20 says, no, we don't ignore it. We can't ignore it. We cannot please God and be servants of Jesus and ignore it. But neither is the answer to slam down our Bibles and bang the pulpits and make somebody feel about 2 inches tall, is it? Is there a medium in there somewhere we can find? To where we address the issues that need to be addressed, where we talk to people about what they need to hear, but we do it in a manner that is loving and gracious and merciful and genuine, that expresses our deep love for them and God's deep love for them. Understanding that sometimes, depending on the person, the language that's going to be used is going to be different. The way that you guys are going to talk to me is going to be completely different than the way that you talk to Sister Stedman or Sister Waller. And it's absolutely right that the way that you would talk to me is different than them. We keep our audience in mind, just like Jesus did. But we do a disservice when we obscure or hide parts of the gospel. And finally, here's the application for me out of John 8 is I've got to abide in the words and the person of Jesus. Because John chapter 8 and verse 31, that is how I truly become a disciple. In verse 32, that's where I find the truth. In verse 32, that's where I find freedom. This is what John 8 is all about. It's about abiding in Jesus, abiding in His words and the blessings that come through that. When I abide in Jesus through keeping His word, I'm set free from sin. Verse 51, truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. He's not talking about physical death there. He's talking about spiritual death. You will never see death. In verse 42, if God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceed forth and have come from God, for I have not even come on my own initiative, but He sent me. If God were your Father, you would love me. I abide in Jesus when I keep His word. I abide in Jesus when I love Him. You know, Jesus talks about that later in John 14, doesn't He? If you love me, you will what? You'll keep my commandments. Loving Jesus, abiding in His word, keeping His commandments, it's all the same. The day it all went downhill, it wasn't Jesus' fault. It wasn't the message that was at fault. Jesus didn't do anything wrong here in John chapter 8. But everything went downhill when those who professed to believe in Jesus suddenly realized what believing in Jesus really meant. It meant they were in sin. It meant they were lost. It meant they were in need of a Savior. And it meant Jesus was the answer. To some, that's a horribly offensive message. But to so many others, that's the message of absolute liberty and freedom and life. Jesus came to give life, to give freedom, to give hope, and to give pardon. And if you need that in your life this morning, if you're lost without those things, Jesus is your answer. His gospel is your answer. His Father is your answer. And if you're ready to respond to Jesus, to respond to God's offer of grace this morning, we're ready to help you do that. Maybe as a Christian, you look at your life and you haven't been following Jesus as you should, but you want to change. We want to pray with you and pray for you and encourage you. If we can help you respond to the gospel in any way this morning, would you let us know by coming while we stand and while we sing?